Good morning or good afternoon for some people. We hope you're enjoying the conference so far. And as you can see, we have a very full day planned for today as well. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Silmy Abdullah, who is an author, lawyer, and social justice advocate. Most recently, Silmy authored the collection of short stories entitled Home of the Floating Lily. Set in both Canada and Bangladesh, the story follows the lives of everyday people as they navigate the complexities of migration, displacement, love, friendship, and family conflict. I encourage you all to read this amazing collection. Silmy has been a lawyer who provides legal services to low-income South Asian clients in Ontario, many of whom are newcomers. And she is now moving on to a consultation practice where she will be working with organizations and institutions on gender-based violence and anti-racism initiatives. Today, Silmy will be speaking to us on why our stories matter, racialized women, immigration, and gender justice in post-pandemic Canada. Now, this session is sponsored by COPA National, whose mission is to prevent violence, bullying, and aggression against children at the individual, organizational, and systemic levels. COPA is also the provincial coordinator of the Francophone component of the Ontario Settlement Workers in Schools program. Just before I turn things over to Silmy, I'd like to remind you that you can ask questions and vote on the questions that you're most interested in through the right-hand Q&A bar. And now, over to you, Silmy.
Thank you very much, Vicki, and hello, everybody. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to be here and to be part of this wonderful and important conference. I want to begin today by telling you about a young woman I know named Shumi. Shumi was born in Bangladesh and lived in the capital city, Dhaka, with her parents until she completed her undergraduate degree in history. She led a simple, happy life with her loving parents, finding joy in doing simple things such as shopping with her girlfriends and playing badminton. One day, a young man from Toronto named Asif and his parents come to visit her and her family in their home. The parents, who knew each other, wanted to introduce the two of them for the purpose of marriage. The young man was also born in Bangladesh, but his family had immigrated to Canada a number of years ago. At first, Shumi is unsure about the prospect of being with this man. She thinks they might be too different, but as she spends time with him, she falls in love and the two of them marry. A year later, Shumi comes to Canada as the sponsored wife of Asif. She moves to Toronto into an apartment complex in a neighborhood where mostly Bangladeshi newcomers live. Soon she discovers that although her husband is still the polite and gentle man she had met back in Bangladesh, he seems more withdrawn, busy with work, perhaps a little disinterested. To fight her loneliness in this new country, she befriends an older woman from the building who she calls Auntie. She visits her for tea and takes cooking lessons from her. Sometimes she walks through the streets by her neighborhood and visits the Bangladeshi convenience stores. She walks by the street-side eateries to take in the smell of snacks that remind her of Bangladesh. One day, her husband surprises her with an announcement that he would be buying a home and taking her away from the neighborhood. He seems happier than usual. Although a part of Shumi is sad that she will be leaving this neighborhood, there is also a part of her that is happy that her husband is finally thinking about their future together. She becomes hopeful when he starts to spend more time with her, encouraging her to take English lessons, cooking with her, making her watch movies to improve her English accent, and buying her clothes that are more in line with fashion in Canada. But then Shumi discovers that all of this is tied to a secret that her husband has been keeping. And when that secret is revealed, she starts to question everything, her life in Canada, her marriage, and she wonders whether she belongs here after all. Not too far from her, in the same apartment complex, lives another woman, Shehnaz, and I also want to tell you a little bit about her. Shehnaz is middle-aged and has lived in Canada for almost 2 decades. She has a teenage daughter born in Canada to whom she's completely dedicated. Shehnaz is technically a single mother. Her husband, an engineer, abandoned her and her daughter a number of years ago, frustrated that he couldn't find a job in Canada in his field. He tries very hard to convince Shehnaz to move back with him, but she refuses for the sake of her daughter's future. But Shahnaz is torn. As much as she's committed to raising her daughter in Canada, she misses the simple pleasures and luxuries of her home country, the comfort of domestic help, the time to make a slowly brewed cup of tea, things she cannot afford in Canada. Here, she wakes up at 5 a.m. to catch the bus to go to Tim Hortons, where she has been working for years to provide for her daughter. Here, she doesn't have anyone to help her. But then something happens in Shahnaz's life, something that causes a rift between her and her daughter and brings her husband back into her life. This sets off a chain of events that pushes Shahnaz to choose between her husband and her daughter, her birth country and the country of her daughter's birth. Finally, I want to tell you about Annie, a young university student living in Toronto, also from the same neighborhood. Annie and her parents had immigrated from Bangladesh, and now she's a Canadian citizen, a bright student who has dreams and ambitions, whose parents want her to give back to this country by going into politics. Every day, like many other students, Annie takes the subway to go to the University of Toronto. One day, as she stands on the station platform, a white man comes up to her, tears off her hijab and yells, "Go home." Shocked, devastated, frustrated, she runs home, and the next day she decides to leave home without her hijab. And throughout her train journey, she wonders what her citizenship that her father is so proud of really means. Who are these women, you might be thinking? Are they my relatives, my friends, people that I have worked with? These women are actually fictional. They're characters from my book, Home of the Floating Lily. But when I was telling you about them, perhaps you felt, at least for a brief moment, that these are real people. Maybe you felt that this could be somebody you know. Perhaps you've met someone like them, and even if you haven't, maybe parts of their story seemed familiar to you. Maybe for a moment or two, you felt that you could connect to them and understand to some extent their struggles, their joys, their emotions, even if they're part of a different community than yours. Perhaps you felt a universal human connection that made you understand what they were going through, made you at least slightly curious to know more. And that is the power of stories. Although my characters are fictional, there are many women like them around us, amongst us, within us. Ultimately, fiction is a reflection of reality, and stories, whether fictional or not, help us connect as humans and create empathy and understanding. Stories have the power to shift narratives and change mindsets and attitudes. Stories can change the world. When I was first asked to give this talk, I thought long and hard about what I should talk about. Should I speak from my experience as a writer or as a lawyer? What could I possibly say to an audience where all of you are experts in your fields? Then I decided that I'll simply draw on my work as a storyteller, and more importantly, as a story listener. Because I believe that it is this act of listening to stories that allows me to tell my stories a bit better, to better serve my clients, my family, my community. In other words, story listening is at the heart of all that I do. We live in a world in which we are bombarded with information. It isn't that there's a lack of stories. Stories are everywhere, narratives are everywhere. In fact, for thousands of years, we humans have made sense of our world through stories. Storytelling has also been acknowledged as an important tool in business and in policymaking. But what is less discussed is the other part of this exercise, without which storytelling is futile, and that is story listening. Are we preoccupied with telling our own stories, or are we also listening to others? Story listening requires us to ask, who has the privilege and opportunity to tell stories? Which stories are we listening to? How do we listen? And is our own storytelling influenced by deep and conscious listening and true understanding? Or is it just another exercise of perpetuating our own biases and prejudice? I have been an immigrant for as long as I can remember, so the words settlement and integration have always been interesting to me. I was born in Bangladesh, where my parents were also born and raised, but at the age of 1, my parents found jobs in Saudi Arabia and we moved there. Then, when I turned 14, we uprooted ourselves once more and moved to Canada. So from a young age, all I knew was this feeling of being unsettled, of having a fluid sense of home, of not knowing exactly where home is. Throughout my life, I've had to constantly negotiate and renegotiate my sense of identity and belonging. In our initial years in Canada, I saw my father take classes in communication. He also took up an evening job in telemarketing so that he could learn the skills of customer service. Despite having over a decade of experience as a pharmacist, he studied for his professional qualifications all over again so that his skills would be worthy enough for Canada. Eventually, my mother also took English classes and upgraded her teaching qualifications. On weekdays, they did everything they could to integrate into Canada and the Canadian system. And on weekends, they took trips to the Bangladeshi convenience stores to buy green chilies and pickles that reminded them of home. At dinner parties, they talked about visiting Desh, which in Bengali means home country, suggesting that home was ultimately somewhere else. But at the same time, they talked about how they could never live there again. The corruption and pollution and lack of good healthcare was just too much. They talked about how Saudi Arabia never accepted them as one of their own, and that at least in Canada, they could become citizens. But at the same time, they felt nostalgic about the countrywide celebrations of Muslim holidays in Saudi Arabia and never having to worry about finding halal food. So from a young age, I felt this constant tug of war between different identities. Sometimes I felt I had multiple homes, other times I felt I had none. And then as I built my life in Canada and met more people, both in my personal and professional life, when I met women like the characters in my book, Shumi, Shahnaz, and Annie, I realized that this feeling of isolation, of not belonging, of not being settled, is the quintessential element of the migrant experience. Any migrant who leaves behind a home in search of a new one leaves a piece of their heart behind, as much as they try to remake their home in a new place. At a very human level, there are feelings of isolation, of loss, of nostalgia, of confusion. And what works to exacerbate these experiences is an underlying narrative in the host country, a dominant story that says that immigrants are the other, they're different, that their values are not in alignment with the values of the country they're coming into, that they need to be taught, trained, acculturated, rescued. Now let's think about Canada's image for a second. We are known to be a country that is welcoming and accepting of immigrants. There was a study done in 2020 that found that Canadians have become more accepting of immigrants. The findings came from a survey done by Environix Institute, a nonprofit organization, where 2,000 Canadians were interviewed between September 8th and 23rd. The study showed that more Canadians are comfortable with current immigration levels, and they see immigrants as good for the economy and not a threat to Canadian jobs. And they believe that immigration is essential to growing the country's population. They believe that immigration makes Canada a better country. But is it enough to see immigrants as good for Canada, that too from a purely economic perspective? What about the question, is Canada good for immigrants? When I arrived in Canada, I had just started high school, and I immersed myself in becoming a good Canadian citizen. I learned about Canadian holidays and history, which of course had no mention about Indigenous history. I read works by F. Scott Fitzgerald and Shakespeare in English class, and I observed how my classmates dressed, how they talked, what their interests were. But what I found was that there wasn't much of an interest from others about learning about me. A classmate once asked me, days after I joined high school, "How do you speak such good English? You have no accent." Once in gym class, a teacher asked me, "Do you have something to play music with at home?" And with hand gestures, she drew a box as if I had never seen a stereo system before. I looked at her shocked and amazed at what she thought of me. Then there were some who looked at my hijab and said, "You must be really hot in that." I look back now and laugh, but when I think about these incidents deeply, I realize that what that really was an exercise of imposing someone else's narrative on me, looking at me how they wanted to see me as a single dimensional object of their stereotype, instead of stepping back and listening to what I had to say about who I was and understanding me as a human being in all of my complexity with intersecting identities. Now, this may seem like a collection of minor isolated incidents, things that happened 20 years ago. But let's fast forward to today and take a moment to reflect on what happened just months ago in London, to that family who were brutally killed while on their walk simply because of their identity. This too we might see as an isolated incident of hate, the senseless act of an individual racist who didn't know any better. But are these really isolated incidents? Whether it is seemingly innocent comments by high school students and teachers 20 years ago or a murder that happened in broad daylight in 2021, we must ask ourselves, what is the story that is driving these acts? Are these incidents happening in a vacuum, or are these a product of the attitudes that are being perpetuated about immigrant, racialized communities in our media, in our school system, by our politicians? When I look back at my high school experience, it isn't that I wasn't welcomed. Most of my teachers were nice, and so are most of my classmates. I looked at the other newcomer students and observed how the teachers and guidance counselors were busy trying to get them accustomed to the school and the school system. But I didn't see much of a reciprocal exchange. I didn't see the newcomer students sharing their own stories and experiences and really getting an opportunity to share who they were, how they were feeling, and what it is that they needed to feel less isolated. There was nothing in the curriculum that exposed students to different cultures and experiences, no books, no novels by racialized authors or Indigenous authors. I saw no relatable people or experiences in what I read and studied, so my feeling of isolation grew. So when we talk about settlement and integration of newcomers, when we talk about providing services to immigrants, whether we're looking at making policy or delivering programs, there's a bigger question we must ask ourselves. What is our approach, and what is the framework within which we are working? Are the services, laws, and policies truly reflective of the needs of immigrant communities based on empathy and a deep understanding of the nuances of their lives? Or are we working within a system that further perpetuates racism, gender inequality, and colonial forms of oppression? How do we talk about settlement and integration in a climate where some stories prevail and others are silenced or never heard? Where migrant communities continue to be othered through laws and policies driven by hegemonic notions and discourse of Canadianness, of who belongs and who doesn't belong? Is the goal to integrate people by assuming what they need when they arrive? Or is our goal as a society to ensure that those coming into Canada feel that they truly belong, to subvert biases and prejudices, to see them as agents and experts of their own lives, to listen to their stories, to understand what their needs are and respecting those needs? I want to take you back to the three women I talked about in the beginning. You may be wondering why I shared stories of women in particular. You might ask, are most of my characters in my book women? It is true that most of them are, not all, but most. Beyond the reason that I myself as an immigrant woman, I have always been curious about listening to women's stories and their lived experiences. Why? Because from my own lived experience and from living and working in the community, I have come to know that immigration is a gendered experience. Gender impacts the reasons people migrate, the pathways through which people come to Canada, and it also informs their social, economic, and emotional experience, their public and private lives as they try to settle in Canada. In my own family, my mother, sister, and I have not experienced immigration the same way my father and brother have. My mother was pregnant when we first arrived, and so while my father struggled tremendously to provide for our family, he was able to qualify himself faster in this country than my mother, who had to wait because of her childcare responsibilities. As a woman of color wearing the hijab, my experience of navigating the school system, the workplace, and the public spaces has been very different from my brother's. The visible markers of my identity have made me more susceptible to scrutiny, Islamophobia, and tokenism, and made me conscious about my sense of belonging at a different level. But there are also many ways in which I have been very privileged. My family is what you may call the economically favorable and profitable immigrants, my parents with professional degrees, which automatically gave me greater privileges in terms of obtaining education and success in Canada. I also had linguistic capital, which made it easier for me to navigate the public sphere, because contrary to what my classmate believed, I did learn English in Saudi Arabia, and that too without an accent. And I still don't know what that means, because I think everybody has some kind of an accent. My family's privilege of status as permanent residents and then citizens gave us access to more benefits and privileges. My home was a loving and supportive one, and I knew that no matter what difficulty I faced outside, I could come back to a home where I would be safe. But there are many women who do not have such privileges and face a multitude of barriers in accessing safety, justice, and equality. If we look at some of the statistics for immigration pathways, in 2019, women accounted for 58% of the caregiver class. In the economic class, they're less likely than men to be the principal applicants, meaning they're more likely to come as their spouses. Women made up 58% of those who arrived under family reunification or a sponsorship program. And this is something I've also routinely seen in my immigration practice. This means that in the economic and family classes, women are mainly arriving as spouses or partners of men. More often than not, they're stuck in low-wage precarious jobs once they arrive, and many of them face workplace exploitation. Language barriers, lack of knowledge of resources and rights keep them stuck in situations of financial dependence or poverty. And even if they have the skills required to find jobs in their field, their childcare responsibilities may set them back. Then there are those women who do not have the privilege of immigration status, such as women who are on their way to becoming permanent residents through their spouses, but because of their experience of domestic abuse, go through relationship breakdown and lose their status, or are threatened with deportation if they leave the relationship. Let's also not forget the many temporary foreign workers, including domestic caregivers, who arrive here and contribute to the Canadian labor market, but are some of the most vulnerable people with numerous obstacles to permanent residence, and too often facing exploitation at work. Many of them are trafficked, and it is not unknown to any of us that it is mostly women and girls who are victims of trafficking in Canada. Many of them don't know their legal rights, and often their employers will confiscate their documents, which often prevents them from renewing their status, and they become stuck in this exploitative cycle due to fear of deportation. These are things that I see in my practice as a provider of legal services, and I'm sure you see this in your day-to-day work as well. A combination of poverty, violence, and immigration precarity also impacts a woman's ability to find affordable housing, access to healthcare, and legal and other services. Whether they're refugee claimants, temporary foreign workers, or dependents of spouses in family or economic classes, it is women and racialized women who are disproportionately impacted by the experience of migration. Different combinations of the multitude of factors such as precarious employment, poverty, domestic violence, workplace exploitation, and fear of losing immigration status give rise to complex, intersecting, diverse, and unique vulnerabilities for racialized immigrant women. This year's theme for the Pathways to Prosperity Conference is post-COVID strategies to address enduring challenges in the settlement and integration of newcomers in Canada. We know that COVID-19 has not presented anything new or surprising. The sad reality is that COVID-19 has only intensified what has already been happening, and the impacts of COVID-19 are rooted in pre-existing inequalities in our society. Again, if we go back to statistics, in the first few weeks of the pandemic, women aged 25 to 54 were twice that of similarly aged men to be working part-time and in precarious work. Within 2 months of the pandemic, 1.5 million women lost their jobs. We know that even pre-COVID, racialized women workers were disproportionately represented in precarious work that is underpaid. According to IRCC, racialized newcomer women have the lowest median annual income of all newcomer groups, compared to non-racialized newcomer women, racialized newcomer men, and non-racialized newcomer men. The employment rate of racialized newcomer women is higher than that of racialized and non-racialized newcomer men based on the 2016 census. In my work, I see racialized newcomer women consistently facing job insecurity as they find temporary short-term work through agencies. Job insecurity and poverty increased manifold during COVID, as many women were forced to choose between working under unsafe conditions and staying home to take care of their families due to school closures. Many couldn't qualify for COVID-related benefits, and even if they did, they didn't apply due to language barriers and confusion around the rules. Pre-pandemic, racialized women were already disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence and faced numerous barriers in accessing help. During COVID-19, more women were stuck with their abusers at home, giving rise to a sharp increase in the incidence of domestic violence. Immigration applications have been taking longer to process, placing many women and families in limbo with respect to their status. For those going through the courts and tribunals, hearings took much longer to be scheduled, and the transition to remote and digital services created more barriers for women to access services. COVID-19 has therefore sharpened the gender inequality that already existed in our society. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the problems because we know the problem and we see it in our day-to-day work. My point in saying all of this is that when we're thinking about strategies to assist newcomers in their settlement and integration, we cannot exclude women from the conversation. We cannot afford to not use a gendered lens when we're thinking about policymaking, service delivery, or any kind of effort to ensure the safety and well-being of immigrant communities. I truly believe that no policy or program is effective if it hasn't addressed the challenges faced by the most marginalized members of society, and racialized women, racialized newcomer women are certainly among some of the most marginalized. And as we apply a gendered lens to the work that we do, we must consistently ask this fundamental question: how are existing systems and structures perpetuating the marginalization of immigrant women? Is there anything in our immigration policies that tells a particular story about who is deserving of safety, equality, and justice in Canada? When we limit pathways to permanent residence for temporary foreign workers, when we restrict access to healthcare and education for people who have lost their status through no fault of their own, what is the message we are sending about who is deserving of dignity and well-being? When a woman comes to access services for the violence she's facing at home, and when we impose our own narratives about why she's facing that violence, when we label racialized men as more violent, more oppressive, when we make violence an inherent part of their culture, what are we doing to really help these women? I want to share a story about a friend of mine who had escaped domestic violence and had started counseling to heal the trauma that she had faced through that experience. Her counselor, instead of listening to her story, and instead of acknowledging the fact that she was looking for services that would be respectful of her culture and her faith, said to her, "Well, this is what happens when you follow a cult-like culture." What that did was immediately shut her down and further isolated her and re-traumatized her. This is what happens when we do not listen and when we underestimate the power of story listening. In 2015, the Conservative government introduced a law called the Barbaric Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. Now let's leave aside the title for a second. This law criminalized forced and early marriage in Canada. And if you look at the provisions in the criminal code, it could potentially criminalize anybody, from family members to neighbors to guests, perhaps anyone who is somehow aiding the process of forced and early marriage. Now, on its face, this looks like a great law because, of course, forced and early marriage these are forms of gender-based violence which must be condemned. But let's look at what the effect of this law really is. Perhaps this law was the most blatant example of the silencing of voices of those very people who the law claimed to help. Organizations who were working on the ground with women, with survivors of forced and early marriage, heard from those women directly, who said over and over again, "We do not want our family members to go to jail. We simply want the behavior to stop. We want access to resources. We want safe housing. We want reconciliation with our family members." But nobody listened. And the bill was passed and made into law. Again, this is one of the clearest examples of culturalization of violence, where violence was treated as an immigrant problem that must be tackled by further marginalizing populations. It really did nothing to go to the root of the problem. The real needs of these women remain unaddressed. It saw violence as an inherent part of an inferior culture, rather than a phenomenon that cuts across all communities. Since the bill was passed, we have barely seen any charges for forced and early marriage. Is it because the practices have magically stopped? No. It's because of what is happening. It's because of what we predicted, that the practice would go further underground and women would simply be too afraid to come forward and seek help out of fear. In my immigration practice, I routinely see decisions made by our government representatives and policymakers that are laden with biases and prejudices. I once had a case where a young woman's sponsorship application was denied. She had a small wedding ceremony in her home country because she had already gone through a bad divorce and wanted to keep her second marriage or second wedding low profile. The government representative who was making the decision on her sponsorship application decided that the culture she came from was known for big weddings. And so because she didn't have one, she must have married her husband only to come to Canada. And she must have engaged in that wedding ceremony secretively. Therefore, her marriage was fake. She had submitted many photographs and evidence, and despite this, her application was denied. In another case, a woman was denied sponsorship because her marriage was seen as fake for marrying an older, divorced man with 2 children. Again, the decision maker decided that that was not common in her culture. There was another woman who was physically beaten and abandoned by her husband after coming to Canada. And because she left the marriage soon after she came to Canada, it was she who was blamed for engaging in a fake marriage simply for getting access to permanent residence. She was the one who had the burden of proving that she left the marriage because of abuse. For many immigrant women, the process of defending oneself and navigating the legal system is extremely onerous because of the barriers they face: language barriers, employment insecurity, fear, lack of knowledge of legal resources. So they're not able to fully communicate their stories. Some women are lucky enough to find good legal representation, and there are many who are not. If they're not able to find representation, their stories remain misunderstood and unheard. We've seen in the context of COVID-19 that many low-income women who had lost their jobs were also on the verge of losing their homes because of their inability to pay rent. And because of their language barriers, they could not communicate their story and could not defend themselves at the tribunal. But sometimes even the most compelling stories remain unheard. Recently, I applied for permanent residence for a family, a woman and her children, on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. This woman has been a victim of domestic abuse for years and has multiple medical conditions. I submitted 300 pages of evidence, and still the decision maker believed they did not deserve to stay in Canada as permanent residents. The decision maker made his own story about why they would be safe in their home country, and in doing so, rejected this family's story, and in turn perpetuated the violence and inequality that they were already facing. I would like to end today with a simple plea. We are all here today because we want to make a difference in the lives of the people we work with. You all do extremely important work, whether you're in settlement services or you're a representative of the government, whether you're an academic or in policy work. I applaud you and congratulate you for the tremendously important work that you do to serve immigrant communities and newcomer communities. I applaud our government for the various efforts to address the challenges faced by migrant communities, particularly women. For instance, for women who have lost the opportunity to permanent residence due to family violence, they are able to apply for temporary resident permits. Temporary foreign workers who are being exploited can apply for open work permits that allow them to look for a new employer. Even though these are temporary measures, they provide evidence of steps in the right direction. It's wonderful that the Racialized Newcomers Women's Pilot, as part of IRCC's settlement program, acknowledges the barriers that racialized women face in entering the workforce. But we still have a long way to go. I believe that as a society, as a country, we can do better. The work that you do has a real significant impact on the lives of people. So my simple plea is for all of us to consistently bring story listening at the core of all that we do. When we're thinking about strategies and solutions for the integration of newcomers, we have to think long-term. We have to think about preventive strategies, not just Band-Aid solutions. There must be a constant reflection of where our gaps are and see how we can build connections and collaborate with those we serve at a very human level. We must look at what is happening on the ground. And even if we have policies and programs in place in theory, are they being translated into practice and in a consistent manner? We must strive towards a systematic dismantling of colonial and oppressive practices. And any work that we do has to be accompanied by a simultaneous, sincere effort to shift narratives and mindsets. And that is where the power of stories lie. We must think of ways to make space for people to share their stories and dismantle the barriers that keep people from sharing their stories, because that is reflective of how willing we are to listen, whether we're service providers, policy and lawmakers, or community members. When we think about pathways to prosperity, we must ask, whose prosperity are we talking about? Is it Canada's prosperity as a nation at the cost of human rights and dignity and gender equality? Or is it the prosperity of all those individuals who together make up Canada as a nation? And can a nation prosper where gender inequality and racism persist, where the needs of the most marginalized remain unaddressed? We also cannot work in silos. Our education sector, the settlement sector, immigration policymakers, and government representatives must all collaborate to find ways to improve their story listening skills. We must critically look at our education system. What books are being offered to students to read? What about Canadian history and the Canadian present are we learning? How much do our young minds know about their neighbors, their friends, the people they go to school with? I would like to propose a simple idea of incorporating literature by racialized authors into our school curriculum. And I believe that reading that literature should be part of the training for educators, policymakers, and service providers. Studies show that literature, particularly fiction, makes us more empathetic and helps us understand each other better. Good, compelling stories about a community give us a window to the nuances and complexities of the lives of its members. They show us their struggles, but at the same time, their power and resilience, their experiences of joy and love and basic human emotions. They connect us by showing us that we are more similar to each other than we think we are. I remember when I was first looking for a publisher for my book, a publishing house had told me, "Nothing really happens in your stories." She then compared my book to another one, saying that that story had what they were looking for. It was a story of a Muslim woman who had found her freedom by escaping the clutches of her oppressive religious father. She suggested that that's what she was looking for in my book. Oppressive brown Muslim men oppress Muslim women. This shows that just as much as stories have the power to dehumanize, they have the tremendous power to humanize. So we must pay attention to whose stories we're listening to and who is telling the stories. That is what forges the connection at the deepest level. My stories tackle issues of immigration, poverty, family conflict, and domestic violence, but I have tried my level best to portray my community as they are, without stereotypical representations of what the Western world wants to see. My characters are human in all their shades and complexities. They are not passive objects without agency, always depressed, waiting to be rescued. They experience joy and sorrow and conflict and are agents of their own lives and lived experiences. In other words, they're human, and we need to see people as human. And really, fiction is just one way to do this. We have to understand that being able to write fiction is also a privilege, and I acknowledge this privilege. I by no means claim to be a representative of my entire community as I tell these stories. There are thousands of people who are waiting to tell their stories, who are telling their stories, and they need to be heard, and now more than ever. As the Canadian Women's Foundation has stated, the COVID-19 pandemic is having an unprecedented impact on vulnerable women and girls throughout Canada. We must find ways to reach out to these women, to understand what their unique needs are, because they are the experts of their lives, and they're the best people to tell us what they need. We must go beyond tokenistic consultations and research studies and think of long-term, ongoing collaborations with community members. They must be involved in every stage of the decision-making process for decisions that impact their lives. And it is critical now more than ever to listen to their stories instead of imposing on them other stories about them. As a great storyteller, and in my opinion, a great story listener, Arundhati Roy has said, "There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Silmy. I just want to remind everybody to please use the Q&A sidebar to submit your questions and also to vote on questions that have already been submitted. And I see that there are already some very interesting questions submitted. So why don't we start? Silmy, what inspired you to start writing your book? And how do you believe your book helps racialized women in Canada?
I think what led me to write my book was just this compulsion. I saw, I mean, part of it was my own lived experience and what I observed around me growing up as an immigrant woman in Canada. I saw rich, diverse stories in my community that nobody was really aware of. And I felt that they needed to be told. And so it was that compulsion that drove me to write this book.
And what do you expect from people who read your book?
My one goal is for people to be able to connect, just to find, even though they're very, they may deal with specific experiences. What I've really strived through these stories in my book is to enable a very human, a universal human connection. So I hope that my stories will foster empathy and understanding, and I hope that we'll be able to find similarities rather than differences.
Thank you. On to the next questions. I would say this is a bit of a difficult question, but we have an answer for it. What books would you most recommend for white Canadian-born allies?
Oh, there are so many. There are so many. It's hard to pick, and I guess what I would recommend is just my opinion. But there are fantastic authors now. There are fantastic Indigenous authors. There are fantastic racialized authors like Uzma Jalaluddin. There's Sherry Demeline, Eden Robinson, Jill Richardson, David Cheriandi. They're all fantastic authors who are really shifting the landscape of literature in Canada and also shifting the narrative.
Thank you. This is a pretty specific question. So the question is whether abused women who leave their spouses lose their PR status.
Not if they're already permanent residents, no. If they already have their status, they don't lose it unless the partner maliciously calls IRCC and tells, which often happens. They will call anonymously and they will say, she married me, she misrepresented, she married me just to get PR in Canada, and that will start an investigation against the spouse who has left. But if she can show that she left because of the abuse, then she's fine. The way you would lose your status or not get your status is if you were on your way to becoming a permanent resident, and because of the abuse, the sponsorship fell apart, or the partner withdrew the application. In that case, you wouldn't be able to get your permanent residence. But if you already have it, then no.
Thank you. Somebody asked if you have a blog or social media where people can hear more from you and about your stories.
I do have a website. I can share that. Yeah, I don't have a blog, but I am on Instagram, I am on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, and I do have a website. So
great, thank you. The next question asks whether you have any suggestions on how to get an immigrant that doesn't identify as a storyteller to start to share their stories. So how do you get people to open up and talk about their lives?
I strongly believe that we're all storytellers. We all have stories within us that are waiting to be told. And I think that our school system has a huge responsibility to make the space a safe one for people to be able to tell their stories. So it's really, the onus is not on the people who are wanting to tell the stories. The onus is on our education system to create that safe space to make way for people to be able to tell stories.
Thank you. And what advice would you give to young immigrants, especially girls, who are facing racism in their schools?
Oh, this is such a tough one. Seek support, talk to somebody, and it's something that I mean, I myself have not figured out, right? Because this is something that we all face, on a regular basis, even if it's in the form of microaggressions and not overt forms of racism, right? But this is something that all racialized individuals deal with. So I think the best way to start to do something is to talk to somebody about it and seek out resources. There are resources out there. So I think, yeah, talking to somebody would be the first step.
Thank you. I have a question myself. Maybe I can jump in and ask it. And you mentioned reciprocal exchange, and that seems to be very important. And I agree with that. But what does this mean in concrete terms, in terms of how that can be implemented?
You mean in our education system specifically, or?
No, in general, more generally.
I think, I guess in concrete terms, it would mean, again, making space for people to be able to come and share their stories and engaging in constant collaboration, and not just, I mean, if we're thinking about policymaking in particular, we cannot just have one or two consultations near the end of the decision-making process and say, well, yeah, we have consulted the communities. No, it has to be from the beginning, right? It has to be, policymakers have to consistently be in touch with the communities that they're seeking to serve and the communities that they're making decisions about, to really hear from them about what their needs are, what the lived experiences are. And so the space has to be made for people to be able to tell their stories. The barriers have to be put down, right? So, and in our education system as well, teachers, I believe that teachers and guidance counselors and the principals have a role in making sure that it's not just a one-way street where we're treating these newcomer students who are coming in as empty vessels that need to be trained and taught and, taught about the culture of Canada. But there really needs to be space for students to be able to enrich others with their experiences that they're bringing in.
Thank you. Another tough question. Do you think there's any hope, possibly through advocacy, in revisiting the bill by the government that would allow for individuals, females who are being married at a young age, or their families, to safely come forward and not feel ostracized?
Yeah, that is a very tough question. I mean, we have to hold on to hope, right? As much as we may feel that there is no hope, that is the one thing that we must hold on to. Otherwise, we cannot go forward. When the organizations were making deputations as the bill was going through Parliament, hope was one thing we held on to, that at least, regardless of what happens, we must voice the needs of these women, and the women must voice their own needs. And so we have to continue to do the work. I'm not sure how we would go about doing that now. There has been no effort by the government to repeal those laws, those provisions. So, I mean, to be honest, I don't know, but we have to have hope.
Thank you. Well, this is an interesting question. Are there any tips you can provide for racialized folks on how to be better allies for each other?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I think this speaks to the fact that racialized communities are also not homogenous entities, right? There's so much diversity within racialized communities, and we have to also remember that there's also discrimination and biases and prejudices within members of racialized communities. So as we are collectively fighting colonialist, oppressive structures, we also have to be mindful not to oppress each other and, respect the diversity that exists within our communities. So again, being mindful of the diversity within our communities and really working together and understanding what our unique needs are within the communities as well.
Thank you. And where do you see the future of immigrants, especially women, in the next 20 years in terms of the challenges they're facing today? You know, we're not talking at our conference about new issues. Do you think we'll still be with these issues in the future, 20 years from now? And do you think there's any light at the end of the tunnel for them?
I mean, we have a long way to go, right? And the fight for women's equality has been going on for many, many years, and I do think it will continue. But I think we have to, I do believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. We have to remember, whether big or small, we have to remember the wins. We have to remember the progress we've made and not fall into a state of despair, because then we have, you know, that would mean that there's nothing else that can be done. So we have to believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And even though there may be challenges, there may be new challenges that come up in the next 20 years. We don't know. But we have to hold on to the hope and keep going.
Any other questions? We still have a bit of time. So this is a question, also a difficult question. How can women complain about racism in situations where managers or leaders of organizations have been in power for years? How do we dismantle those structures?
I mean, that's something, when it comes to dismantling structures, that's not a short-term exercise. That's something that we have to just keep doing. You know, it's a long-term challenge, and it's a long-term goal that we need to have, and that will definitely take time. Dismantling structures take time, because it goes to you know, I guess it involves unlearning what we have learned over years and years and years. And we have to look at the fact that our country's history is rooted in racism and colonialism and genocide. So it will take time to dismantle those. In terms of how to deal with it, I guess on an individual level, it's difficult because sometimes racism, or most of the time, I'd say racism is not overt, right? So how do we challenge those incidents of racism when we know that the person is being racist, but we can't quite pinpoint it because it's not overt, right? And so, I mean, the law is there, protections are there for you know, acts of discrimination. So I would say, if we're looking at, or if we're thinking of concrete ways to battle racism and discrimination, my suggestion would be to educate ourselves on what the law says. What are the resources that are out there? And really try to find ways to involve ourselves in systemic change and in changing the law and decision making. So, but the first step for that is to educate yourself in terms of what is actually out there. Because I think that will empower you with the tools to be able to do something.
So thinking about people with perhaps good intentions, how can the different levels of government and other stakeholders work together transparently and sincerely to address the challenges? And what should be the starting point for them?
I think the starting point would be to have the willingness and the openness to try and really understand what is happening on the ground. It just cannot be a top-down approach. We have to collaborate with the communities that are directly being affected by the decisions that are being made by our government. So that collaboration has to be key. And for that, we need to have that openness and that willingness to be able to work with the communities.
Okay. A bit of a personal question. How did you respond to the people who asked you about your accent or lack of an accent? And looking back now at who you were before, is there anything that you would change about your response?
No, I don't think so, because I think I sort of laughed it off at that point just because I thought it was such a ridiculous question. And I think I would do the same now. I would just laugh it off. I don't think I would try to, prove otherwise, that no, there are countries in the world who have English as part of their education system, right? So I don't know. I don't think I would change my response. No.
You wouldn't try to educate at all?
Maybe, but at that point in time, I think I would try to educate, but not in that manner, not responding in a defensive manner. I would say I would perhaps bring it up in another conversation or try to do something else, but not at that moment, I don't think.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like the more long-term idea.
Yeah.
You mentioned that women seeking justice would sometimes prefer reconciliation with family members who have committed abuses. Would you recommend more choices by police services or the justice system for victims, such as a restorative justice process versus the regular justice system?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we have to really ask the women who are coming for help what it is that they want. And I think the options that should be available should be based on what their needs are. So the agency has to lie with the women.
And are there currently alternative forms of support available for those who stay in those relationships?
Alternative forms for women who stay. I mean, I guess they could go for counseling, right? Like that's one thing. There are definitely resources available. For example, the South Asian Legal Clinic provides support for women who are either at risk of forced marriage or in a forced marriage. So yeah, they could, I mean, women could seek support at any stage, but it's just that I think the question is how comfortable are they to come and seek those services without fear of repercussions because of the criminal laws that we have in place, right? So.
Thank you. And do you have any closing words or final words you'd like to say to this group?
I just want to thank everybody for watching and listening today, and thank you all for the amazing work that you do. So.
Oh, and we want to thank you so much for this powerful presentation. I saw there were lots of comments and people asking whether you'd be available for other webinars. And of course, people can contact you directly for that, I'm sure. So thank you so much, though, for coming and being with us today and for presenting and for putting yourself out there and fielding these questions, some of which are personal, that take advantage of your professional expertise.
It's my pleasure.
Yes. And one final thing is, if anybody is interested in purchasing a copy of Silmy's book, there is an exhibitor who is selling the books. It's Perfect Books in the exhibit hall, and please go there if you're interested to purchase the book. And I'm sure there'll be more conversations on this topic as we go forward. So thank you again, Silmy.
Thank you, Vicky. And thanks everyone for joining.
And so we're now going to take a break, and the next session starts at 1:15. Please take the opportunity to visit the posters, the exhibitors. Some of the exhibitors are doing presentations, and you also have a chance to network with all the attendees here today through the networking function. So thank you, everybody, and we will be back at 1:15.